Hello everyone, I hope you're doing alright. Today we're going to be releasing the long-awaited rankings for every single class in this game. As a player who has taken the time to research, write, record, publish video guides for every single spec in this game, and as someone who has extensive experience with pretty much every form of content, I feel like I'm in a unique position to make this video. However, I am aware that this is only my opinion. If you disagree with me, that's great. Just let me know down in the comments below so that I can farm the algorithm. Alright. Let's get started all the way down in D tier. Now let me give a brief disclaimer that just because a class lands in D tier doesn't mean that you can't play it. Plenty of people do. It just means that the class is in major needs of a buff in order to make it a viable pick, as it is underperforming and unsatisfying to play in its current form. The worst of the worst is, unfortunately, Marksman and Sharpshooter. This is an agonizing decision for me because I've loved this spec for 10 years. It's been my baby. I love how simple the rotation is. I love the class fantasy of just being the greatest shot in the galaxy. However, even a marksman stand like myself cannot deny the fact that the spec just does no damage. It's truly a pathetic experience trying to make this spec work, and even worse, it has basically no defensive cooldowns. So if people get on top of you, you just kind of die. I wish I had more nice things to say about the spec, but I just don't. It's awful and deserves its spot as the worst of the worst on this list. Unfortunately, my second favorite class in the game, Arsenal and Gunnery, also live down here in D tier for very similar reasons. Now, I'll be the first to say that the spec's defensive toolkit is relatively impressive and that it can melt a player in PvP if you get lucky with your crits. It's very new player friendly and it's relatively simple to understand as a class, but with the 7.0 changes making us choose between key defensive cooldowns, Arsenal has become a static turret. Even worse, we're a static turret that does no damage outside of our brief burst windows. Add that to a clunky heat management system and the entire spec feels like bathing in jello. It's slow, it's unsatisfying, and it makes me just feel weird. The spec is fine for learning the basics, but you will notice just how much it's underperforming compared to its peers, D. This wraps up the D tier. Let's move up to C tier. C I label as underperforming but not unplayable. If you want to choose these classes, you'll raise some eyebrows, but you won't be seen as a leper. Starting off C tier is Carnage and Combat. Now, I'll be the first to admit that Carnage can do some seriously impressive damage within their ferocity burst windows, and that it has a relatively decent defensive toolkit. However, outside of those burst windows, the spec plays like a car running out of gas. It has an extremely clunky rotation if you choose to follow it, and even if you do, it does piss poor sustained damage. Worst of all, it is severely outperformed by its sister spec Fury and Annihilation. There is one bright side though, because Combat has some of the best animations in the entire game, so it's pretty to look at even if the damage is not. Until it receives some substantial buffs, Carnage is going to live comfortably down here at the bottom of C tier. Rounding up the tier is Innovative Ordnance and Assault Specialist. Once again, I find one of my most beloved classes truly suffering in its current state. IO has a great defensive toolkit, good mobility, and some decent utility, but the damage is sincerely underwhelming. In a spec that's supposed to be a burst and a dot spec built into one package, it has neither burst nor enjoyable dot mechanics. The damage just kind of flounders along and never really has that satisfying moment of detonation where you really take chunks out of health bars. It's slated to get a set of upgrades soon, so hopefully that'll make the spec more enjoyable, but for right now it's just an unsatisfying shell of its former glory and will live at the top of C tier. Alright, let's move up to B tier. B tier specs are perfectly playable in any form of content, but they usually have some drawbacks that keep it from bursting into the higher tiers. To kick things off at B tier, let's talk about Madness and Balance. Madness does okay damage, has okay survivability, and has okay utility. Everything about it is pretty much just okay, except for the fact that it's boring to play. With an extremely fixed and repetitive rotation combined with limited mobility, the hardest part about playing Madness is not falling asleep at the keyboard. Granted, if you can stay awake, it does everything else just fine, which is why it falls down here at the bottom of B tier. Next up in B tier, we have Concealment and Scrapper. Now, Concealment's damage is actually pretty spectacular. With great burst and sustained damage, it's actually pretty easy to top the meters in average goop content as Concealment if you can stay alive, which is the primary reason that Concealment is living down here in B tier. Its defensive toolkit is laughably bad, especially for a melee class. It is the ultimate glass cannon that will absolutely punish you if you make a mistake, or sometimes it'll just punish you because the game is doing an overtuned amount of damage that Concealment just can't handle. It also lacks any meaningful AoE damage, which is a significant downgrade in most forms of content. However, if you're looking for straight up single target damage, you could do a lot worse than Concealment and Scrapper. Next up in B tier, we have Lightning and Telekinetics. Lightning can be either a hyper-mobile spec that can be played almost entirely on the run, or it can be a turreted, hard-casted force sniper that basically never moves, and unfortunately it's pretty average at pretty much everything. It has an average defensive toolkit, does an average amount of damage, has an average amount of utility, it's just kind of painfully average. Combine being average with a slow, plodding along rotation, and you'll have a class that's perfectly suited for B tier. Up next we have Deception and Infiltration. Much like Lightning before it, Deception is pretty average in most respects, average damage, average defensives, average utility, but it has the distinct difference of actually being fun to play. The mechanics are relatively straightforward, you're not bound to a set rotation, it's fast paced, and you can do a surprising amount of burst damage in a pinch, so while it might not be the best class out there, it's probably the most fun of the average classes. Up next we have the first tank spec in the form of Immortal and Defense. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. With a surprisingly sparse defensive toolkit for a tank, mediocre opportunities for cheese, and a lack of health recovery mechanics, Immortal can feel surprisingly vulnerable at times, and you'll often find yourself faltering where other tanks would have been just fine. Now that's not to say that the spec is unplayable, it's still perfectly serviceable in most forms of content, but it just ends up falling behind its tanking peers in pretty much all respects, which is why it has to live down here in B tier. Next we have our first healer, Corruption and Seer. With decent single target heals and moderately available area of effect heals, Corruption is perfectly capable of getting the job done in all forms of content, but it's just going to be a little clunky along the way. With so much to juggle as a Corruption healer, you would think that the healing would reward high level play, but the numbers come out being painfully average, which can be a bit unsatisfying. And through no fault of its own, Corruption and Seer have to be compared to Medicine and Sawbones players, which is dramatically outperforming everyone else at the moment. So it's not really that Corruption is necessarily a bad spec, it just has to be compared to a spec that is way outperforming everyone else in the field, so it has to live down here in B tier for me. In a similar vein, Bodyguard and Combat Medic live down here in B tier as well, placing slightly ahead of Corruption for the fact that it's just more straightforward to play. With decent single target heals, built-in AoE, and a pretty straightforward healing setup, Bodyguard is a phenomenal healer for anyone looking to click pretty green buttons for the first time. I debated putting this spec up in A tier, but because it has to be compared with Medicine and Sawbones, it kinda has to live down here in B tier next to its Corruption brother. Rounding up the Bs, we have Engineering and SWTOR. Now this is the perfect spec if you want to juggle plates. The rotation is pretty straightforward, it has decent AoE damage built into the rotation, and it's somewhat engaging to play. However, the static nature of the rotation can become a bit dull, and if the target decides to walk out of your AoEs, you will lose out on a lot of damage. Additionally, Sniper really lacks in the defensive department, so we don't really have the tools to stay alive compared to some of the other specs. Typically this would land a spec in the middle of B tier, but Ionic Discharge is just so much fun that it has to live up at the top of B tier. Alright, now we're moving into A tier. These are classes that are fun to play and are performing well, but you won't get called a meta-abusing munchkin if you play them. Kicking things off, we have the last range spec on the list, Virulence and Dirty Fighting. Virulence suffers a similar problem to Engineering with its lack of defensive cooldowns and a relatively straightforward rotation. However, with improved mobility and the opportunity for fluffing dots and just straight up superior damage, Virulence gets bumped up the list to low A tier. Up next we have Hatred. Hatred is currently pumping numbers, so if you want straight up damage, this just might be the spec for you. However, its defensive toolkit is kind of lacking, and the rotation can be a bit dull while also relying on a fair bit of RNG to flow properly. So it's somehow smooth but clunky, which can just feel a little weird at times. But if damage is the name of your game and you run into the opportunity for big AoE fluff, then Hatred will sit comfortably here in A tier. We're starting to enter the truly fun territory here with our next entrant of Rage and Focus. With phenomenal burst damage, decent sustain damage, and moderate survivability, Rage is in a solid spot in the meta. With one of the greatest burst windows the game has ever seen, this spec can absolutely pump numbers in all forms of content. While its limited AoE potential and defensive toolkit do hold it back from being S tier, Rage has weaseled its way into my heart, and I'm proud to stick it here in the middle of A tier. Now we arrive at the next tank in Darkness and Kinetic Combat. Darkness, as usual, has some phenomenal cheese, great utility, and pretty straightforward damage on top of great AoE management. With a solid set of defensives, good passive damage reduction, and great threat generation, the only real knock that I have on Darkness is that it can be a little finicky when you're learning the class, but once you figure it out, it's a solid tank that deserves its spot here in A tier. Similarly, Shield Tech and Shield Specialist have phenomenal passive damage reduction with its heavy armor, easy to understand defensive cooldowns, and extremely forgiving mechanics. It's pretty much baby's first tank. It's really hard to go wrong as a Shield Specialist, and you don't have the option to mess it up like you can with Darkness Tank. And while you don't have great cheese opportunities, I would find anyone hard pressed to think that Shield Specialist deserves anything less than a solid A as the top tank on the list. Back in the realm of DPS, I've slotted POWERTECH and PLASMATECH as one of the better A tier specs. Between great single target sustained damage, amazing cleave and fluff potential, and a surprising amount of burst, Pyro is in a great position in the game right now. Its damage combined with a decent defensive toolkit sets it up for success in pretty much all form of content except for one downside, that it will kick you in the teeth if you're not careful. If you botch your heat management, you will be in for a bad time, but if you can keep the horse under control, you're in for the ride of your life, so it's a solid high A. However, if I had to choose between Pyro and its brother spec of AP and Tactics, then I have to give the edge to AP simply because I have more fun with it. The burst damage and sustained damage are just ridiculous, it has a solid defensive toolkit, and it has one of the most fun tacticals in the game with Flame Detonation. Granted, Flame Detonation isn't the greatest replacement for AoE fluff damage, so it does fall behind Pyro in that regard, but it's really hard to find a replacement for the sheer joy of back-to-back energy bursting someone's entire health bar into the dirt, so I have to give AP the edge in pure fun factor alone, which places it firmly at the top of A tier. Alright, we have arrived. S tier. This is the tier where if you play these specs, you are a meta-chasing munchkin who needs to claim, oh no, I've loved this spec for years, when we all know it's been sitting in the closet gathering mothballs until the last expansion hit, and then you decided to pick it back up again. There's no shame in that, it is what it is. Kicking off S tier, we have Annihilation and Watchman, which is probably the most requested DPS in the entire game right now because it does great damage, has great defensives, and has great cleave, and can be pumping out a ridiculous amount of healing to keep the raid topped off all at the same time. The class also benefits from not having a set rotation, so it's much more of a flowy priority system that is extremely satisfying to play. The only thing keeping Annie down here at the bottom of S tier is the fact that if you get unlucky, you can run into some rage generation issues, and it's a little difficult to learn. For those reasons, Annie is going to rest comfortably here at the bottom of S tier. But if I had to pick between Annie and her cousins Vengeance and Vigilance, then Annie can hit the road. Vengeance on its own has an easy to understand single target rotation / priority system, has a perfectly average set of defensive cooldowns, and is one of the best classes that a new player can jump into. However, there is a tactical that bumps this into mid S tier in the form of Cut to Pieces. I've said it before and I will say it again, Cut to Pieces is the most fun you can have with your pants on. Cut to Pieces Slam Spam produces so much serotonin that I pretty much find myself only wanting to bring Vengeance into every single form of content. Heroics, Vengeance. Flashpoints, Vengeance. Operations, Vengeance. Regs, Vengeance. Ranked, Vengeance. It's a pure joy to play, and I am proud to place this class solidly in the middle of S tier. But what if you could have the AoE potential of Vengeance combined with exceptional defensive cooldowns and even a fair bit of healing? Well, then you'd be playing Lethality and Ruffian. Lethality has all the upsides of Vengeance, but none of the downsides. Great single target damage, brilliant AoE fluff, good sustain, good burst, good defensive, good heals. There's nothing that Lethality doesn't do well. It's a jack of all trades and a master of all trades too. I wish I could find a downside to the spec, but I just can't. It's a solid S tier and a great choice all around. Wrapping up the healers and sitting towards the top of S tier is Medicine and Sawbones. Look, you've all seen the numbers, you know what the deal is. All the other healers look up to us with our giant, throbbing, menacing heal parse with jealousy and with good reasons. Medicine does oogles and boogles of both single target and raid heals, and everyone else can get cucked. Now the spec's defensive toolkit can be a little lacking, and its burst healing isn't entirely sustainable, and it's a little challenging to get your hands on at first, but the sheer healing output is just ridiculous compared to its peers, so it has to live up here in S tier, and every single healer is going to agree with me because I am correct. And now for the best spec in all of SWTOR. There is no sense in building up any sort of anticipation here because you know it, I know it. Fury and Concentration are light years beyond everyone else in the field right now, and it's not even close. The combination of single target burst damage and single target sustained damage means the spec absolutely pumps numbers in all forms of content. This, combined with a great defensive toolkit, means that Fury is going to hit you like a train and can take damage like a truck. Now, it doesn't have the built-in AoE, but that can be fixed with a rotation swap and a few utilities, meaning that you could be doing enormous burst and AoE pretty much at will. To top it all off, the spec is just fun to play, which is a lot more than what can be said for a lot of the specs living down in the other tiers. It's fun, it's engaging, it's a monster in all forms of content, and it's living proudly at the top of S tier. So, those are my rankings. And as I said before, these are just my opinion. At the end of the day, the spec you find to be the most fun is always going to be S tier to you, so I recommend playing the class you think looks the coolest over any metric or list that you find on the internet. Additionally, this is more of a general ranking across all forms of content, and if you go into different forms of the endgame, the tiers do change a bit. For example, in endgame PvP, stealth-capable classes get bumped up the list and classes with poor defenses get bumped down, and in Nightmare PvE raiding, classes with high raid utility and sheer damage output do get bumped up, while underperforming and overshadowed classes get bumped down. So be aware that not all classes are created equal depending on what content you're getting into. But if you disagree with me and my opinions, then you can get bent. It's my list, I'll do what I want. If you think your list is better, feel free to let me know down in the comments below to help me farm those YouTube points, and like and subscribe while you're at it, I really do appreciate it. Thanks, may the force be with you.